On March 4, 2026, Formula One's race director did something that had never been done before in the history of the sport. He scrapped the curfew. Every team was told they could work through the night, Wednesday and Thursday, building cars against the clock at Albert Park. The reason was that half the paddock was still scattered across 3 continents, stranded after Middle Eastern airspace shut down and took the sport's main travel routes with it. Mercedes' reserve driver, Fred Vesti, would not land in Melbourne until Thursday evening. Ferrari staff had been stuck in Doha since the weekend, and the Australian Grand Prix CEO had just told national television that everything was fine. It was not fine, and the travel chaos was only part of the story. The race start procedure had been completely overhauled after practice starts in Bahrain. Testing produced scenes nobody wanted to see repeated on race day. Only about 2 cars got away cleanly. The rest sat on the grid, in anti-stall, while the lights went out above them. The FIA responded with a new warning sequence, and all teams agreed to ban straight mode from the grid, entirely after Oscar Piastri warned that 22 cars launching with drastically reduced downforce was, in his words, a recipe for disaster. This was supposed to be the grand opening of a new era, the biggest regulation change in Formula One history. New cars, new power units, new aerodynamics, active wings, the whole lot. Instead, it became a weekend defined by scrambling, improvisation, and last-minute rule changes. And that it happened at all might be the single most impressive thing about the entire weekend. So, let us start with the travel situation, because the timeline here is worth understanding. How Middle Eastern airspace killed F1's travel plans. The conflict in the Middle East escalated sharply at the end of February 2026. Without getting into the geopolitics of it, the practical consequence for Formula One was immediate and severe. The 3 major connecting hubs that European-based teams depend on for long-haul travel, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha, all shut down as Persian Gulf airspace closed. Emirates grounded flights, Etihad grounded flights, Qatar Airways grounded flights, and roughly 1,000 Formula One personnel who had booked through those hubs suddenly had no way to reach Melbourne. Now, F1 is a sport that moves around the world with military precision. Equipment ships weeks in advance on cargo planes and container vessels. Personnel fly commercial, usually through the Middle East, because that is simply the most efficient routing from Europe to Asia and Oceania. When those routes disappear overnight, there is no backup plan sitting in a drawer. You improvise. Ferrari and Mercedes stranded. Ferrari and Racing Bulls got hit the worst. Their entire traveling crews were stuck in Italy after planned Middle Eastern routings collapsed. Several Ferrari mechanics had been stranded in Qatar since the previous weekend, unable to leave as the situation deteriorated around them. Ferrari ended up reassigning test team members to fill operational gaps, pulling in people who were not originally scheduled to work the race weekend. Mercedes and McLaren had a different problem. Both teams had personnel in Bahrain for a Pirelli wet tire test that got cancelled for obvious safety reasons. Fred Vesti and other staff spent days confined to their hotel in Bahrain while the situation outside grew worse. They finally made it back to Heathrow on Tuesday evening, March 3rd, still roughly 17,000 kilometers from Melbourne, still with a car to help build before Friday morning. Toto Wolff captured the mood perfectly in his Australian Grand Prix preview. He said, "With the ongoing situation in the Middle East, it seems trivial to talk about sport." And he was right. The whole paddock understood this was not a scheduling inconvenience. People were dying. But the show, as it always does in Formula One, had to go on. The solution came from a sports travel agency called Travel Places, who coordinated what can only be described as an emergency airlift. 3 charter flights were booked to carry approximately 500 paddock personnel, staff from 10 of the 11 teams, plus F1 officials, to Melbourne via routes that completely avoided Middle Eastern airspace. One was a British Airways plane routed through Singapore. Another was a business-class air service that flew through Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Yes, Tanzania. A third took an undisclosed alternative path. Individual staff found their own creative solutions too, booking through Fiji, San Francisco, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and China, whatever had open airspace and a connection that eventually pointed toward Australia. Both main charters left London on Monday night, March 3rd, and touched down in Australia on Wednesday, March 4th, 2 days before first practice. That is cutting it close by anyone's standards. But by Formula One standards, where teams typically arrive days early to set up and acclimate, it was practically emergency surgery. And then there was Fred Vesti, the Mercedes reserve driver who had bounced from Bahrain to Heathrow, to eventually Melbourne. A Mercedes spokesperson told media that Vesti and other team members expected to be in Australia by Thursday evening. First practice was Friday at 12:30 local time. That left roughly 16 to 18 hours of margin. For context, Most teams like to have at least 48 hours on the ground before the first session. Vesti had barely enough time to shake off jet lag before climbing into the simulator, what Melbourne's CEO got wrong. Now, pause on Travis Old's timeline here, because the contrast between what Melbourne's organizers were saying publicly and what the FIA was doing privately tells you everything about how close this really got. On Monday, Old was on Channel 9's Today Show at the Albert Park paddock, cameras rolling, telling Australia not to worry. He said the Formula One organization are very good at moving people around the world. That is what they do. He estimated close to 1,000 people needed flights changed, but insisted the situation was under control. All the freight is here, he said. The cars are sitting on the main straight in containers ready to go. You will not see any surprise drivers under a helmet. That was Monday. By Wednesday, the FIA's response was not reassurance. It was a formal declaration that the rules, at least certain rules, no longer applied. Force majeure, a rule change never seen before. On Wednesday afternoon, race director Rui Marquez issued an official communication to all 11 teams. Due to force majeure and specifically ongoing travel and freight disruptions, the provisions of Restricted Period 1 and Restricted Period 2 would not apply at the Australian Grand Prix. That is the curfew, the rule that forces teams to leave the circuit for set periods before practice sessions, so mechanics get rest and teams cannot simply outspend each other with round-the-clock labor. Restricted Period 1 normally kicks in 42 hours before FP1. Restricted Period 2 starts 18 hours before. During those windows, the 16 classified operational personnel and 16 training personnel per team are banned from the circuit. These rules exist for good reason. They protect the health of mechanics who would otherwise work themselves into the ground under pressure from team principals demanding every last tenth of a second. Scrapping them had never happened before, not once in the history of the curfew system. And the reason it happened now was simple. Cars were sitting in shipping containers on the Albert Park main straight, and the people who needed to build them had not arrived yet or were arriving so late that the normal preparation schedule was impossible to maintain. Now Autoport reported that none of the teams actually had critical operational staff missing. The key personnel had been prioritized on those charter flights, but the teams collectively asked the FIA to relax the curfews anyway, because the margin was so thin that even a minor delay could have cascading consequences. When you are building the most complex racing cars ever constructed under an entirely new set of regulations, you want every hour you can get. The biggest regulation overhaul in F1 history. Now, what made Melbourne's logistics situation even more precarious is that it landed on top of an existing crisis that had nothing to do with geopolitics. The 22.6 regulations represented the biggest technical overhaul in Formula One history. New power units, new aerodynamic philosophy, active front and rear wings, the removal of the MGUH, revised cost cap structure. Everything was new, and everything was new at the same time.